Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's a Saturday night live stream, a spontaneous event in many respects because I'm jumping on to give my immediate response to the series of demonstrations that took place today across Britain. I believe there's been others in other areas of the world as well, but I was at the one today in Manchester, which had one point, I think, at least a couple of thousand on it as it was going through this area in Manchester called Rusholme, and was sizable and was very noisy and was, of course, largely, as far as I could tell, left alone by the officers of the local constabulary, having distinguished themselves, of course, that is Greater Manchester Police, by arresting a teenager waving a Palestinian flag the other day. Today there was hundreds of people waving flags, and as far as I could tell, nobody got nicked. So plainly the senior officers and potentially the government themselves have decided that it's wouldn't be a good idea to try and do mass arrests for waving a flag. So as far as I can tell, the instructions from our particularly moronic Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, and that's in the line, along the lines of, by the way, a series of particularly obnoxiously stupid Home Secretaries. For those of you who aren't familiar with the rather arcane titles of the British Cabinet, the Secretary of State for Home Affairs is the minister who's broadly speaking in charge of policing matters. And she was issuing all kinds of directives that, you know, anybody who waves a Palestinian flag's got to be arrested. Anybody who says or sings from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, should be arrested. And so, of course, everybody is singing that on the Manchester demo and also the other demonstrations that took place. Of course, it was all dwarfed by the London demonstration, which, according to estimates from comrades who were there, had around about 50 to 60,000 turning up outside the BBC, it seems. And this was, of course, very, very sizable and would have been, should we say, a bit of a headache for those working inside the propaganda centre, which was good. And so for having a few days' notice to put these things together, I think that this turned out very well, about as well as you could expect. And the one in Manchester had a range of people at it. There were, of course, the layer of the professional left in the city, which has at various points included myself, and they were all there, but there's no more than about 100 to 200 of them at the very most. So this was many more than that. It was clearly attended by a lot of people who were Palestinians in exile, also other nationalities from across the Middle East. It attracted a big crowd going through, as I said, Rusholme, which is the typically Middle Eastern, Pakistani, Bangladeshi area in Manchester. It's known as the Curry Mile rather affectionately. So it picked up a lot of people going through there and marched all the way to the city centre, and would have made a bit of an impact. Everybody, it would have been noticed by everybody. So I think, as far as we could tell, this was objective achieved for now. And Other comrades will, of course, have reports from various other areas in the country. I'm aware that there was several that took place in Ireland, for instance. There was, as far as I know, at least a couple in Scotland. I know our comrade Ben is in the chat this evening, so I'm sure I know that he attended one. Edinburgh, 3 to 4,000. Glasgow, 10 to 15,000. Wow, that is very significant for. That's very good in Glasgow. Very good indeed. Kind of puts the Manchester numbers to shame, to be honest. So that's very good. Comment from Jay in the chat who says, I am disappointed that I haven't seen any large-scale pro-Palestinian gatherings here in the US. If there have been, they haven't been covered by independent media. I saw, other Americans may want to comment on this. I saw a couple of demonstrations that did take place in New York. I'm not aware of any others, though. I know there was a demonstration of leftist Jewish groups today opposed to Netanyahu, which was good. Outside of New York, though, I haven't seen anything else going on. Oh, I know that there was one in Chicago. Our comrade Slava was posting about that last night on the stream. So I haven't seen any reports coming from those yet, but I will post them on Telegram and on Twitter when I see them. So yes, this is clearly a good starting point, and there's a base there to build on. And I want to address that tonight because the question came in from one of our regular listeners and viewers, Morgan, an Irish comrade, who sent in a question about what to do, how to build on this. So I will address that and throw out some ideas later on the program. But I wanted just to mention a couple of other things, which is that in relation to the situation in Gaza, of course, it remains the case that the US seems to be behind. In fact, there's no seems about it. They are behind the attempt to try and essentially do a mass population transfer out of Gaza. They were apparently Biden, or whoever's giving Biden the lines, was on the phone to Abbas today. And it seems like they were trying to pressure him to agree to this population transfer, which is what the American administration wants. Abbas, of course, refused, because if he agrees to that, just the same way that we were talking about last night, that General Sisi isn't going to agree to that, nor are any of even the Arab reactionary regimes going to come out into the open and agree to that. Because, again, that's them openly collaborating with the mass expulsion of Palestinians from their land. That's them collaborating directly with Nakba too. Now, none of these people are particularly principled. None of them would seriously stand up for anything other than preserving their own power and preserving their own profits. But they're not stupid. They know that if they're seen to be collaborating with this, as does Abbas, who is a collaborator anyway, and he's seen by not just the supporters of Hamas, but the supporters of the PFLP, the DFLP, and just about every other Palestinian group as just being a comprador and a collaborator. He can't come out and agree to that, because then that would, I don't know what it would take to push the population of the West Bank to the point where they directly go out and overthrow Abbas, but I can only think that it's getting close to his position being untenable. And so it's no wonder he declined Biden's offer, which I bet was probably accompanied by all kinds of offers of bribes. But it seems like this is not something that the Israelis are going to get. And there's been rallies inside Gaza itself that I've seen film of today, mass demonstrations declaring that people aren't leaving, they're going to stay and they're going to fight. So essentially, this is the US have been trying to find a way to make this look less ugly, and they can't. They can't, because no one will openly collaborate with them on it. And so we are moving towards the point where Netanyahu and his crew have to make their move. Now, they have managed to put together a war cabinet, which consists of Netanyahu, two of his Likud guys, including Gallant, the defense minister, who was saying all kinds of like crazed genocidal things the other day because he's been shown up by this and made to look very weak and very pathetic. And Benny Gantz, former chief of the Israeli army's defense staff, he's being brought in. He's the major opposition leader. He and Netanyahu despise each other. And they're bringing back this guy, a bit of a blast from the past, this guy called Avigdor Lieberman, who's from Moldova originally. And they're bringing him in. And he was regarded as the yesterday's extremist. He was the guy who, when he was brought in by Netanyahu over a decade ago now, was regarded as this guy is crazy, wild, over-the-top, ultra-Zionist. He's now been replaced by people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, the interior minister of Israel, who makes Lieberman look like some kind of like blushing pacifist. So the significance of the Americans cobbling together this war cabinet of Netanyahu's, because make no mistake, all the players involved here, Gantz and Netanyahu and others, will all have been under extreme pressure from the US imperialists to put this together. And the US imperialists have achieved one of their objectives in putting this together, which is that they've frozen out Ben-Gvir and the other open fascists. They've got a bunch of other fascists in there and mass murderers who just don't openly declare it as much. And the other thing they've achieved is that they have got the Knesset to essentially shelve that controversial judicial reform that Netanyahu and his crew have been pursuing. And they have said that the Knesset is only going to deal with wartime matters for the duration of this emergency. So that's another thing the Americans wanted. If you go back and look at the interviews that Thomas Friedman was giving, actually what he has been campaigning for, he's got some of it. And bear in mind, Friedman's not speaking for himself. He's speaking for a body of opinion within US government and US ruling class circles, which is that he was saying that people of his school of thought wanted Ben-Gvir and the others frozen out of the big decisions, and they've kind of got that now. They wanted the Netanyahu judicial reforms at least stopped, and they've got that now. That's not going ahead. As a course of a sop to Ben-Gvir and the Kahanists, the Netanyahu's given them the right to form all these militias from the West Bank settlers, who are now roving around gunning down Palestinians at will, more so than they were already. So let's be clear about what's being done here. But here's the point. The slamming together of this coalition has been done at the behest of the United States. They couldn't agree for almost a week to form this coalition. They've only finalized it today, which means there was all kinds of rows going on, of pressure being applied to various characters in the Israeli political system to actually put this thing together. And they've finally done it after a week. Now, you would have thought that in a country that was more stable, they could have put this together after a day, but it took them almost 7 days. And that makes me think that there were a lot of people inside that Israeli opposition movement who didn't want to go anywhere near a coalition with Netanyahu right now, not out of any principled objection, but because they know that he's politically sinking. And to quote the Polish reactionaries, when a man is drowning, he might grab you and drown you with him. When, of course, they were referring to our old friend Zelensky. So they've put this unity cabinet together. They have, to a certain extent, frozen out the open Kahanists, and now they've just got the regular lunatics in there. And they are moving to an apparent attempt to go into Gaza from the north, which is apparently why they issued this demand for an evacuation. Now, I read on one of the Palestinian channels, the Resistance News Network, that they wanted to they wanted to make it clear that the Israelis often issue these demands for evacuation, that this is part of a long-term strategy that the Israelis use to demand evacuation, basically as a cover for them bombing a particular area. Then they can say, oh, well, we issued a warning. But of course, yesterday when people did start evacuating, the Israelis bombed them as they were moving in a column down the road. So clearly now the chances of anybody leaving have slimmed down to practically zero. The Egyptians have also sealed the border. And again, General Sisi doesn't want to be caught openly collaborating on this. So it's now reaching the point where the pressure is such on Netanyahu that, and the others, that they're gonna have to make some kind of move, because they know, and the American imperialists know, that the military positions of Hamas are underground, and that it's more than likely that all this bombing is killing a lot of people, murdering a lot of civilians, but it's not affecting the fighting capacity of the armed groups inside Gaza, the ability of the Palestinian armed forces to actually resist. So all the bombing that they're doing now should be seen in the same light as all the bombing that they did in the war of 2006, where they tried to destroy the will of the Lebanese population to unify behind Hezbollah by doing indiscriminate bombings of Beirut and other urban centers in Lebanon. It was an incredibly cynical attempt to essentially restart a Lebanese civil war, which is what Israel was aiming for there. So the indiscriminate bombing of the Gaza Strip is essentially the same thing. Not only is it collective punishment, which is of course obvious here, but also they are attempting to drive a wedge between the Palestinian civilian population and the unified forces of the resistance. Because again, it's wrong to say it's Israel v Hamas. It's Israel versus the Palestinian nation and the unified Palestinian armed forces. So they now have to move. There is apparently an enormous row going on inside the Israeli war cabinet as to exactly how far they go into Gaza. My suspicion is, and again, this is my speculation, that Benny Gantz, the former chief of the defense staff, understands very well what going all the way into Gaza would mean. And he understands very well that it would mean mass casualties and potentially the further destabilization of the Israeli state. And the suspicion I have is that he may be the one that's objecting to a plan of the ultras, which is to go all the way in no matter what the cost. And this row, I think, will be resolved in the end by an intervention, again, from the United States. Ultimately, there's all kinds of stories now going around, certainly inside the British political media and political echo chamber, where, yes, you get your pound shop reactionary arseholes like Douglas Murray saying, "Oh, kill them all." Well, after you, Douglas. I'm sure the IDF is taking foreign volunteers right now, so why don't we take all of the enthusiasts for mass slaughter in the British media and pack them off to Israel and give them a gun. Let's see how long they last. But the point is that you've got people like Crispin Blunt. Now, if you don't know who Crispin Blunt is, he's got the most ludicrous English bourgeois name you could possibly find. He's the uncle of the actress Emily Blunt, if you're wondering who he is. Long-time Conservative MP, former military officer, has been close at various stages to British intelligence. You've got him, you've got Alicia Kearns, who's another member of Parliament, Conservative, also very close to MI6. You've got even like various media figures who are just complete sort of howling, ridiculous reactionaries like Piers Morgan, now saying, well, maybe the mass carpet bombing and invasion of Gaza isn't a good idea. Now, none of these people, people like Morgan don't come up with these perspectives on their own. It's a reflection of the conversations that are being had inside ruling class circles in Britain now. And it's clear that within certain areas of the British state, namely the British state bureaucracy, the British defence establishment, certainly its hierarchy, and the British Foreign Intelligence Service, MI6, there are people who see this as a bad idea. Now, again, this is not out of humanitarianism. None of these people have a shred of that. What they do have, though, is the ability to perhaps see a little bit further than the crazed reactionaries who are running around screaming for, mass murder. And they can see that not only is it going to be likely that the battle plan of the Palestinian armed forces is for a ground war in Gaza, and therefore they will have spent the previous almost 9 years now since the last major Israeli ground incursion planning for this, and therefore any Israeli attack will be met with very significant resistance and will likely be met with a degree of armed force that we haven't seen yet. Because bear in mind, the Israeli and American estimations as to the actual strength of the Palestinian force that went into Israel last weekend is that it's between 1 to 1,500 men. So 1 to 1,500 men caused the state of Israel to slip into a panic and cause the Israeli military in several areas to collapse. If you look at the estimate, the death toll that's now been published by the Israeli military, you can see that the Palestinian armed forces managed to kill a large number of the officer corps of the apparently Israeli army elite units. They captured several high-ranking officers from the Israeli Special Forces units. They killed many more of them. They were successful in storming bases and killing Israeli forces before they could even get out of bed. It was a catastrophic shock attack for the Israeli armed forces, which is why the Americans scrambled everything that they've got, including now not just one aircraft carrier, they're apparently sending another one. Now, that all doesn't really make any sense, considering that other than the gliders that the Palestinian armed forces were using, they don't have an air force, nor do Hezbollah, by the way. And I think even if the Lebanese got involved, they haven't got much of one. So why the hell are you sending not just one aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald Ford, which apparently steamed ahead of its protection group to reach the coast off Lebanon in double quick time? Apparently it can do that because it's a nuclear powered ship and therefore capable of quite a high degree of speed. So it did that because they wanted to get some military assets off the coast. According to the Russo-American, shall we say, commentator Mark Sloboda, he thinks that the Americans have sent special forces into Gaza already. Maybe they have. It would certainly make sense if the American imperialists wanted to insert forces there. My guess is that the Palestinian intelligence service have more than been ready for that. They must have known that such a devastating attack on the Israelis would bring the Americans out into the open, which it has done. And I think this is another very important political achievement that the Palestinian armed forces have achieved, which is they've demonstrated in front of everybody what Marxist-Leninists have said for a very long time, which is that Israel is only about as independent as Ukraine is. It's just a more successful version of it. I mean, there was a talk given by Max Blumenthal to, it was the Ron Paul Institute, just a couple of weeks ago, where he said that Ukraine was going to be a big Israel, and that this was the plan. And I at the time, I didn't quite understand what he was talking about. I must confess, I didn't really get his point. But now, having gone back and watched the talk again, I understand completely what he was saying, which is that Ukraine was going to be designed, or at least this is what Zelensky and Ermak and Podolyak wanted, and their clique, was that Israel operates as essentially an armed encampment in the Middle East. It's the way it's always done. And it's there to enforce the will of American imperialism. And it exists solely for that purpose. Now, of course, it's becoming more and more unstable as it drifts more and more into decay, and it's the bourgeois political sphere becomes more degenerated and dominated by the Kahanists, who are basically the Jewish equivalent, the Zionist equivalent of the Banderists. In fact, they probably get on quite well together. So this is clearly what they had in mind for Ukraine. So when when you look at Israel, you can't call this an independent country. An independent country would not need the leading military power in the world. And I think overall, you can still say that the US is the leading military power in the world, at least in terms of the amount of force that they can project anywhere else in the world. Certainly that's true. Even if you look at the actual US army these days, as many US commentators with experience of this do, and say it's not up to much anymore. Certainly their navy is still sizable enough. If you can send 2 aircraft carrier groups just to one region of the world and still have at least 3 more, then that's clearly significant. Their submarine fleet is, according to even analysts who aren't favourable towards the rest of their forces, like Andrei Martynov, he still rates it highly. And on that particular point, I think he's worth listening to. So they're still the leading military power in the world. Overall, in terms of the amount of capital they can move around, they're still the leading economic power, though, of course, that title is being taken away slowly by the Chinese. Needless to say, though, they are still, at this point, number 1 overall. And so to need them to come in and essentially have to put a large amount of naval assets and air assets off your coast, to have the US government need to essentially batter your political class into making an agreement with each other. And then, of course, to have the US then need to urgently resupply your army, that's not an independent country. To need billions a year from the US to essentially prop up the army, again, that's not an independent country. That's a country which exists by dint of the imperial favor. Originally Britain, now the United States. And again, so when you look at to go back to Blumenthal's point, which is that the Ukrainians wanted to be a big Israel, well, that's exactly right. And they wanted to be so with regard to making trouble for Russia. The problem for the attempt to make a big Israel is that, of course, Israel is a settler colony. And Ukraine isn't. In fact, the Ukraine doesn't have people going to it, it has people leaving it, and has had for quite some time. So this was never going to work. It might not even work in Israel for much longer, given the number of people who are leaving. So again, like, this is a country which is not independent. It's not sovereign. It's a US colonial enterprise, and a very unstable one at that. And this takes us back to the fact that they are all having rows with each other about how they're going to proceed. Well, they're having an enormous row with each other, because if this goes as badly as apparently the British military and intelligence hierarchy think it's going to go, then you are going to look at much more instability inside Israel itself. Some of the more sane reactionaries in Israel do understand that. But of course, Netanyahu can't stop. If he stops, he's finished. But if he carries on, he's also finished. And we turn our attention, of course, to the wider picture. And there's been shelling going back and forth over the border with Lebanon today. There was at least one Hezbollah fighter killed. Hezbollah responded by taking out Israeli radar installations and attacking an area called the Sheba Farms, which is like one of the few areas that was Lebanese territory that the Israelis hung on to after they withdrew from South Lebanon in 2000. So the situation remains on a knife edge. The Iranians are doing a lot of work in the region, trying to pull the various regimes that exist there into some kind of unity. Who knows how that's going to go? Apparently the Chinese and the Russians have agree upon this two-state solution, which I've explained before. I just don't think is much of a flyer as an idea. I think it's an idea which, of course, is going to be agreed upon by the by the various parties in the Middle East. But of course, the two votes that count, the one vote that counts, US imperialism, is never going to agree to a Russian, Chinese, Arab peace plan. They're never going to agree to their colonial enterprise being dismantled. You're not going to get support for that in the US political system, nor are you going to get, likewise, any support for it from any Israeli politician outside of the Israeli Communist Party and the Arab parties that form a coalition with them. And they only have about, 4 seats in the Israeli Knesset? There's no support for that at this stage. Now, of course, the dynamics can change. If Israel loses badly this war on the ground, or even if they are able to win, but it's incredibly costly, maybe that'll change. Who knows? But we'll see how that develops. It's also clear to me that the Iranians, or at least the Iranian political structure, didn't know this was coming, because they seem to be scrambling around to try and unify the various shades of Middle Eastern opinion behind some common position. I would bet that some people in the Iranian military and intelligence side had a suspicion it was coming, but I don't think most of them did. Certainly, I don't think that this was their instigation. So, this is very interesting situation, to say the very least. I will now pause before going on to the question to read out some comments. Hello to Big Meanie, who apparently attended a large protest in New York yesterday. Good on you. Dean says, I think I saw you over there, but I was talking, couldn't come over. That Zionist Copper's Knot YouTube nuisance Charlie Veitch was dangerously close. I don't know who that is, Dean, if you could specify. Good evening to my comrade Terry from the Class Consciousness Project. Be sure to check out our latest articles on Mick Lynch, the phony messiah, and the situation in Greece. Good evening to Irish Partisan, who also has an eye on the rugby. Well, I don't blame you. Good evening to my comrade Jason from the Class Consciousness Project, and good morning to Ash over there in Melbourne. Jay says, I see the Dwight Eisenhower leave here. It was a rushed deployment. Yeah, panic moves, basically. And good evening to Martin over there in the United States. So, moving to the question that was addressed to us by Morgan in the Telegram group. I'm going to read the whole question out. Won't be watching live this evening, but I would ask what Alex's thoughts are on action that could be taken at this time, e.g. aid, promotion of boycott, divestment and sanctions, protest at Shannon Airport use in Ireland, weapons manufacturing in Britain. What should we do to ensure unions, political groups we are involved with are emboldened to unequivocally support the cause of Palestine and avoid two-sided language? Might be a broad request, but seeing Sinn Féin and People Before Profit trip over themselves today was eye-opening. And if you're not familiar with what Morgan's referring to there, apparently Sinn Féin turned up at one of the rallies in Ireland and tried to do a both sides speech, which went down badly. Apparently People Before Profit did as well, and they're the Irish Socialist Workers' Party, which I found strange because they're usually very consistent on that issue, but Morgan informed me in a response to my clarification question that apparently their speaker at this rally today tried to both sides it as well. So this is classic Trotskyites as well. They, even when they are taking an apparently consistent position, they crumble back and try and appeal to liberals at the first sign of problems. So, interesting question as to where we go from here. I think it's going to need to be an issue we revisit on numerous different occasions. But to give an initial idea, I think that there was, of course, if you remember this, in the 1980s in Britain, a big movement called, I think it was called the Greenham Common Women's Movement. And that was a movement against the stationing of US Pershing cruise missiles in Britain. Greenham Common, I think, is the place that they were going to be stashed. And this was quite a large and significantly supportive movement in the early 1980s. They were demonized by the bourgeois press, of course. Thatcher denounced them. I think Heseltine went there and stood on a tank or something ridiculous. But the this was significant, and it annoyed the bourgeoisie quite significantly. So this, of course, died off, I think, after about 85, 86. And there hasn't really been in Britain a campaign against the US military presence here for quite a long time. I think the Greenham Common Women were the last to do it. There wasn't even, I think there was some movements tried to do this 20 years ago during the Iraq War, but not hugely. It's kind of been knocked out of the political system. I think the bourgeoisie were very keen to see it vanquished. But I think this could be an opportunity for us to revive that. A lot of the aircraft that the US uses to operate in the Middle East do fly from here. For instance, in the middle 80s, they were doing their bombing runs over Libya from here. RAF Lakenheath, a lot of the US bases, by the way, they're all called RAF bases, but they're almost exclusively operated by the US Air Force. So one thing we may, I think should actually get going again is serious campaigns against the US military presence in Britain. Because, again, as I've been outlining in this broadcast, without the US presence, there is no Israel. Israel is a US colonial enterprise. Without US military support, pretty much round the clock now, it seems, Israel falls into pieces. The Israeli state falls apart. So campaigning against US bases here, and also to continue the campaigns that have started but need to be strengthened against NATO. So it is essentially, we should use this as an opportunity to talk to more people against who are against the actions of Israel, to explain the true nature of Israel as a US colonial operation, and also to explain how this fits into the US projection of power through the military and political alliances that it dominates, like NATO. So in British terms, we should revive campaigns against US military presence, build out further campaigns against NATO, link the US and British, but principally US, because they're the ones that really count here, support for Israel with the wider questions of NATO. Use this as an opportunity to build a proper anti-imperialist understanding of what has been going on in Donbass for the last 9 years, how that links to the question of the Israeli state, how all of these are of a piece. Again, Blumenthal's talk on Ukraine as a big Israel is a good entry point for people to actually look at this and open up their minds as to like exactly how they should be viewing both questions. Because a lot of people on that demo today in Manchester, I'm sure this is true everywhere else as well, will probably have been garbage on the question of the Russian special military operation, or would have been at least very dubious on it. Like all the trot groups who were at the Manchester demo today, they'd have all been fucking crap on the Ukraine question. Now, they were all there today shouting Free Palestine. You look into their actual positions, though, and their actual analysis tells a bit of a different story. And I'll be going through some of that analysis in a show tomorrow. So, using it as an opportunity to build a wider campaign against the US empire, against the US military presence in Britain. And if you're further afield, if you're in another NATO country, I think the same opportunity should be taken. And going back to where the question originated from, which is, of course, a comrade in Ireland, I mean, the use of Shannon Airport's been a controversy for a long time. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Irish friends, but the old position of Sinn Féin used to be against that. I don't believe it is the case any longer. And also to build our wider case, we should be using the flight of Ursula von der Leyen and all the EU officials flying into Tel Aviv to give unconditional backing to Netanyahu. We should definitely use that in our campaigns against the EU. We should be definitely using that to say, well, look, the EU, NATO, US imperialism as a series of alliances, networks, institutions. This is a cohesive picture. The EU and US imperialism are now, I think always were to some degree, but now very definitely are, of a piece. They are all part of one big entity. And so you can't campaign against one without campaigning against the other. Now, I think that this is, again, an opportunity for us to clarify things, which is that, well, if you want to see justice for the Palestinians, then that doesn't just involve the pressure on the Israeli state, important though that is. It involves dismantling the US empire. And I think that can be a message that Americans can take up as well. This isn't just a question of Benjamin Netanyahu being a corrupt, murdering bastard, even though he's all of those things. It's a question of the fact that he is the Americans' creature and always has been. And he understands the role of Israel, which is why he's been very successful in terms of his political career. But this is what we need to be doing. We need to be making the links for people here and demonstrating how this works. Demonstrating that the NATO war, US-led war against Russia, is of a piece with the Israeli war on the Palestinians. These are two manifestations of US imperialism. Their expansion of NATO, their bringing in all these Eastern European countries into it, their attempt to dismember Russia, their attempt to do the same thing to the Chinese, all of which will fail, by the way. This is all of a piece with their complete 100% support for Israel, which will continue, by the way. I mean, to go back to what we were talking about with regard to the PFLP statement yesterday, Israel is the Zionists are such a good investment for US imperialism, because the Zionists will commit any crime and fight the most fanatical of them to the bitter end, which is why they're such good tools for US imperialism. All of these interconnections need to be made for people. Seeing reacting with revulsion to the crimes of the Israeli state against the Palestinian people, it's a very good starting point for people. But again, this needs to be put into the global context, and we need to then look at or encourage people to see the connection with removing US power in our own countries, dismantling the European Union, dismantling NATO, getting US forces out of all of our countries. That's a good demand. And you can show up, by the way, if you're in France, for instance, or particularly if you're in Germany or Italy, where there was ferocious repression unleashed by, of course, the Parisian cops against the Palestine demo, as there always is by the Parisian cops. Also, a lot of violent responses from the Italian police, easy mistake to make, against the demonstrations there. But I think the question of Italian or German sovereignty can be taken up by communists, because the right-wingers, the likes of the AfD in Germany, or Meloni in Italy, or Le Pen in France, they've all flirted with this idea of the reassertion of sovereignty, flirted with the idea of some form of revived nationalism. None of them are going to do it, by the way. They're all there because the ruling classes from which all of these right-wing forces ultimately do spring, no matter how populist they present themselves as being, all of them are ultimately creatures of the bourgeoisie. And even the more, shall we say, ambitious bits of the French or German or Italian bourgeoisie, or the British, are still very much weakened. The reason why the pro-US bit of the bourgeoisie has won every single argument in these countries over the last 30 years is because the condition of all of these nations in terms of being a capitalist power has weakened. And as they've weakened, they've retreated further inside the collective of the European Union and inside the collective of the NATO military alliance, which is why they're all clinging desperately to the US no matter what. And so a real campaign to free Europe from US military occupation, which is what it is under right now, with the active collaboration of the various ruling classes. This is a US military occupation of Italy, of Germany especially, and of the other countries where the US military is present as well. a campaign to remove those bases, remove the US military from Europe in its entirety. And Americans can take this up too. Americans can take this up and say, why are we all the way across Europe? I mean, Trump played with this, but again, these right wingers, because they all come up with this idea, because to some of them it sounds good, but they can't follow through with it because their class basis doesn't allow them to. There's no real, at the moment, existing ruling class base other than like in a tiny minority for US isolationism. Without the US empire, US capitalism is fucked. Without the remains of the British Empire, British capitalism is fucked. French capitalism is getting fucked by being forced to withdraw from places like Niger. So again, this whole question of building a genuine anti-imperialist front in all of these countries to, first of all, make sure that we build a movement against the war on the Palestinian people, but also then to make sure that we are building that out into a wider question of why is it that that our ruling class has us enmeshed in this widespread military alliance? Why is our country dominated by US military bases? Why are all the EU leaders flying down to shake hands with the bloody criminals in Tel Aviv? And the answer all comes back to the role of the US empire. And so this is what we need to be building upon. We can start off with demonstrations, of course, but then more challenging actions need to be considered, such as demonstrations outside of the military bases, which of course come with a very strong risk of arrest. So that needs to be carefully evaluated before any action is carried out. But this is where we need to go to. It needs to be broadened out. We need to build this campaign for the national liberation of the Palestinians into a wider campaign against US imperialism and all its works. And I'm sure that there are many out there who are making these links, but I think we need to be much stronger in making them. And that requires, of course, also much stronger statements in full solidarity with the Palestinian national liberation struggle. There's so many communist parties, and I've been posting some of the statements today, like the Turks or the new Communist Party of Yugoslavia, who when the issue of the role of Hamas comes up, they go completely weak. They start repeating imperialist talking points. They might defend the rights of the Palestinians for national liberation, but they see Hamas in a lead role and they shit themselves and run away. You can't do that. Whatever your opinion on Hamas as a Islamic nationalist movement, they are the movement that is in the lead at this moment of the Palestinian liberation struggle. And if you say you support that struggle, but you don't support the lead element in it, then you don't really support that struggle. That's the unfortunate reality. We're not playing fantasy football here. We're not selecting our Dream 11 from the top 20 national liberation organizations that we'd prefer. We don't get to choose for the Palestinians how they conduct their struggle or how they choose their leadership. How arrogant is it to think that we can? We can't. And so I don't know what it is that's caused the Turkish and the Yugoslav communist organizations to be so weak on this. It could be that they're following the lead of the Israeli Communist Party, who are, of course, for the two-state solution. For the Turks, it could be the role that Erdogan has with regard to his connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, which has connections to Hamas. Don't know what the hell the excuse of the Yugoslav party is, but either way, like these weak statements and this cringing before the propaganda, the sort of war on terror era propaganda of the bourgeoisie, that all needs to stop. I'm not calling for anybody to go out and march down through central London with a Hamas t-shirt on or anything silly like that, but this rhetorical cowardice that a lot of the communist parties have been engaging in, and of course the most disgusting example being the French Communist Party saying, well, we've always fought Hamas. Well, you also, as I said last night, you also used to fight for Algeria to remain part of France. So quite frankly, fuck you. But this is the direction that we need to go in, basically. Again, this is an issue we will need to return to over and over again, because we will need to keep assessing and reassessing the position as we go forward. Right, I'll now pause for some questions, comments, etc. Ben says, one thing about the speeches on the platform in Edinburgh is the desperate need for an analysis of imperialism. Even if good, not one speaker gave a clear analysis. Did anyone else hear such a speaker? I didn't. To be honest, I heard a lot of exhortations and no analysis of imperialism given. This is what we need to bring to the movement and popularize throughout it. Ash says, SWP counterparts in Australia have always questioned the right of Israel to exist. One good position. Yeah, they do, and then they'll do something completely ridiculous, like they'll compromise with the Liberals on something just needlessly. They can't stop themselves being opportunistic. Yes, Ash says, the CPGBML pamphlet on Zionism looks interesting. The audio book is out for free. Yeah, I've posted that on the channel. You can go to the CPGBML website and get that. Its audio version is out, so go listen to that on your gym session or something. Very much worth getting, as is the book by Harpal Brar and Ella Rule on the Palestine question too. Hello to Bot Noob, who's tuned in. Irish Partisan says, Sinn Féin dropped their objection to the US use of Shannon Airport. What a surprise. Dean's responded to my question, says, Charlie Veitch, former city trader, oh, what a surprise, turned libertarian-leaning YouTuber, used to pump out some okay material on police powers when I was degenerated into doing petty bourgeois pornography pieces. That sounds disgusting. Poking cameras at lumpen elements in Manchester to get a reaction. Oh, so he's that kind of guy. I didn't know that he was around the place. Actually, I might have seen him and didn't know who he was. I saw some guy acting like a bit of a tit with a camera. He looked about like mid to late 30s. If that was him, I was probably stood right next to him. I didn't even realise. Ash says, my old organisation has a position that two states will be two capitalist states, so we should support a socialist solution by reuniting Palestinian and Israeli workers. Would they have said that about South Africa? As far as I remember, the CWI, and I think you and I were in the same international organisation at one stage, Ash, had a position on South Africa that was that they were for a workers' revolution. Now, it's a little bit easier to hold that position with regard to South Africa because the white population was a hell of a lot smaller. I think it was only about 10 to 15% of the population were white settlers in South Africa, whereas, of course, in Israel, it's a hell of a lot bigger. So that's an immediate difficulty. I mean, the PFLP's always been for the one-state solution. So I think that's the if I was going to take it, if I'm taking a lead on this, that's the lead I would take. I'd also say that's more of a realistic prospect. I mean, this two-state solution thing is actually the more utopian position, as I've explained before. Like, I just do not see, barring either one of two things. Either there is a level of working class revolt inside the United States that leads them to essentially pull back from their imperial commitments, including Israel. And by the way, Israel will be the last thing they would give up because of its importance in the Middle East and the Middle Eastern region's importance for US imperialism. I think they'd give up their positions in Europe, a lot of them, before they gave up the position in Israel. So, again, I just don't see how this two-state thing is going to come about. I'm prepared if Putin can prove me wrong, then, well, I will address the point. But I just do not see how this Israeli political establishment agrees to anything like that. Again, they stopped the settlement program. There is no Zionist project anymore. There is no Israel anymore. It will fall into crisis. Even if the Chinese, the Russians, the Saudis normalize with it and agree to trade with it, all the contradictions which are built up inside Israel right now would explode all over again if they agreed to a two-state solution. I just don't see it personally. As to how a one-state solution would come about, that's a subject for a whole other program, but I will cover that in the near future. Bot Noob says, do you think the censorship online will end? No, it will get worse. It'll get worse because their aim is to make sure that free speech online is confined to tiny corners of the internet, like this one, basically. I mean, I'm under no illusions here. I'm allowed to speak relatively freely to you because I don't have the, Julian Assange-like audience. If we got to a point where we started making serious headway, this channel would be censored, possibly banned, and I might be black bagged and taken to one of America's delightful Butlins resorts overseas. I joke about the latter part, by the way. They'd probably just demonetize me and debank me or something. But the point is that they want to keep free expression confined. What they're afraid of is that what they would identify as fringe ideas would break out into the system. To quote Adam Bolton, this grotesque creature who used to be the chief political correspondent for Sky News, he said that it would, he said of GB News of all things, which is just a complete reactionary joke of a channel, but he said it was unbalancing the delicate media ecosystem. Now, what they're always afraid of, and which is why they do so much on disinformation, so-called disinformation, is that what they regard, the ruling class that is, as fringe ideas, that they become popularized. And they become popularized through exposure to the masses through like Facebook or Twitter, or breaking through into like a major national platform, getting access to Sky, ITN or BBC, which they're very careful to keep very much under control. And that's what they're afraid of. And that's why they went apeshit at Facebook after 2016. They blamed Facebook for Brexit and Trump. They go apeshit at Twitter or X. They try and control that, because what these platforms represent is like you can be a page with 50 followers posting Mao quotes all day about hanging landlords. They don't care about that. However, if you start to popularize Marxism and those ideas start to break out into groups that are much wider than, so we say, 50 Western Maoists being weird, that's when they have a problem. That's when they need to shut you down. That's when they need to push you back into your corner or stamp you out entirely. This is the so-called delicate ecosystem that Adam Bolton is referring to. It's quite an interesting turn of phrase he deployed there. I should really thank him for it, because it's an interesting way to explain the subject. And so that's what they're aiming to do with online censorship. Right. Dean says, Claire Daly, despite possessing some flaws, at least has stayed firm on the flights from Shannon Airport and challenging Ireland's fabled neutrality, whereas her former comrades have collapsed on this. Oh, God, is that... I met Claire Daly years ago when she was in the Irish CWI, the Socialist Party Ireland. I was actually campaigning for her and Joe Higgins, if any of you know him, in Dublin. It must be late 2010, I think it was, or 2011. I can't remember quite when. Over a decade ago. It was in the election where Higgins and Daly got elected to the Irish Parliament, the Dáil. And so I did some work in Dublin campaigning for both of them. And campaigning for Higgins mostly. And so I know that Daly left and then ended up with Wallace in the EU Parliament. And is it the CWI in Ireland that's completely collapsed, or whatever they turned into? I know that they went through a split. Is this like Paul Murphy's lot? And what was the other woman's name? Can't remember now. That have become like pro-NATO or something. If anybody can clarify. And Ash says, true about Trots, the Aussie counterpart used to protest an Israeli chocolate shop called Max Brenner, screaming free Palestine at mums and kids out getting hot chocolate. Trots just take the easy route. Yeah, I mean, it's not exactly building the struggle. I mean, the actions against like arms companies, that's a serious piece of action, because that's something that the bourgeois state is very much keen on keeping open, keeping the weapons flowing. Yelling at a chocolate shop just seems a bit daft to the ordinary working class person. You being out there yelling your head off is just going to seem a bit weird. Going and shutting down a weapons factory, which the Elbit campaigners did, again, that's a much more serious piece of action. Irish Partisan says the only Irish political parties that have a consistent policy on imperialism, Ukraine and Palestine, are the Irish Republican parties. IRSP, Republican Sinn Féin, Workers' Party, 32 Counties Sovereignty Movement, and Irigi. Very true. I think I posted most of their reactions. So, hello to Beju down there in Barnet. Vanessa Bealey and Jackson Hinkle's channels have got zapped, says Irish Partisan. Yep, and they'll have got zapped because whatever criticisms I have of Hinkle, he was reaching a big audience with a message the US bourgeois doesn't really want to get out there, particularly on Ukraine. I think he's been decent on Israel as well. I haven't really watched anything he's done on that. Vanessa Bealey, well, yeah, I mean, she's been hitting the ball out of the park, so to speak, on first on Syria, then on Ukraine. So I can see why the bourgeois wanted her shut down. And Irish Partisan adds, Alex Jones said that after he got banned, he warned others, especially the left, not to celebrate because the establishment or globalists would eventually come after them. Yeah, I mean, the celebration of Alex Jones getting banned was always ridiculous because he was always the test subject. It was always going to be everyone else. I mean, particularly now when you've got a big majority of the US ruling class now agreeing with each other that something must be done about the radical students and something must be done about anybody expressing genuine solidarity with Palestine. Well, now you're going to see a whole new wave of censorship that's going to take up quite a bit of the US left, or whatever remains of it. Anything that expresses solidarity with Palestine is now at risk. Now, we'll see if they're prepared to do that. We'll see how that goes. So, Bottom says, hence the censorship statement you made earlier. Yeah. Irish Partisan says, Joe Higgins retired from politics. He was in the Socialist Party along with Claire Daly. The remainder of the SP merged with the SWP to form People Before Profit Alliance. An unholy alliance of trots indeed, my God. Right. Slightly shorter tonight because I've got to knock off and do some stuff before calling it a day. I will be back tomorrow where we're going to go into various positions that have been published about the situation in Palestine and why they're flawed. I also want to revisit or go back to what's going on in Ukraine, some interesting developments with regard to the Russian advances around Avdiivka and other areas. Also, various Ukrainian officials now admitting what everybody knew anyway, that the much fabled offensive has been a catastrophic disaster. Arestovich is coming out and calling for Zelensky to be removed. Clearly things are not going well there, and now it's starting to filter through even into the rarefied atmosphere of the presidential inner circle. So stuff to talk about there. What I'm going to do, I'll be back again tomorrow at 10, so join me again for that. Audio of this will be going up on Patreon straight afterwards, and the Patreon specials are being edited at the moment, so those will be put up tomorrow and Monday. Thank you everybody for tuning in. I'll be back again with you tomorrow, and I'm going to transfer you back over to the very appropriate music.
Freedom!